The US is currently in the grips of a devastating opioid crisis. Whole communities have been destroyed, families torn apart, countless lives destroyed or ended prematurely. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDCP, more than 1 million people have died in the country since 1999 from a drug overdose. Since then, the problem has only gotten worse. But why? More than 75% of drug overdose deaths in 2021 involved an opioid, in effect, prescription drugs. The vast majority of these deaths, nearly 88% in all, involved synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Staggeringly, that's 10 times the number recorded 25 years ago. A Newsweek report from 2022 puts this in even starker terms. More Americans have died from fentanyl overdoses than in the entire Vietnam War. What makes these figures even more chilling is the unlikely source of the ingredients, or precursor chemicals, that go into making fentanyl: China. At this point, you'd be forgiven for asking the obvious question: why would China be manufacturing and exporting the ingredients for a synthetic opioid that's decimating US towns and cities? Is there something more sinister at play here? Is China deliberately trying to destroy the US with drugs? That's what we'll attempt to answer in this video, and be warned, the reality of the situation is both shocking and unexpected. But before we go any further, let's take a closer look at the synthetic opioid that's causing the most damage in America today: fentanyl. What is fentanyl exactly, and why is it having such a devastating effect? According to the American Addiction Center, fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 more times powerful than morphine. First developed in the late 1950s, it has potent and fast-acting pain-relieving effects. Typically, the drug is prescribed for patients recovering from surgery and those in extreme pain. More generally, opioids are substances that work in the nervous system of the body or in specific receptors in the brain to reduce the intensity of pain. However, the effects of fentanyl don't last very long, hence the reason it carries such a dangerous potential for abuse. When someone takes fentanyl, particularly in large doses, it doesn't just relieve pain, but also creates a sense of euphoria or extreme relaxation that's associated with many illegal narcotics. Often mixed with other drugs such as cocaine or methamphetamine, fentanyl frequently leads to accidental overdoses, resulting in fatal respiratory failure. More pertinently, it's cheaper to manufacture than most drugs and much easier to transport than heroin. Ultimately, this drug is hugely addictive and thus in huge demand across America and beyond. And if something's in huge demand in today's world, there will inevitably be a supplier. That's where China has struck up an unlikely alliance with the Mexican drug cartels. Highly persuasive evidence points to Chinese precursor chemicals being transported to Mexico in staggeringly huge amounts. In drug-making facilities across the country, the cartels then refine these substances into fentanyl and other opioids and smuggle them into the US. But let's take a step back for a moment. What about the legal ramifications of handling these chemicals in China? After all, Beijing has always taken an incredibly hard line on drugs. You only need to take a look at the current legislation to understand just how hard that line is. In accordance with China's Article 347 Criminal Code, no matter the amount of drugs a person smuggles, traffics, carries, and/or manufactures, they shall be sentenced. In China, the most popular drugs are heroin and crystal meth. If a person smuggles, traffics, carries, and/or manufactures an amount of over 50 grams, they may be sentenced to death by shooting. That's right, a firing squad. If the amount involved is less than 10 grams, a sentence of around 7 years is to be expected. And drug crimes are taken so seriously in China that those accused don't usually get bail after they get arrested. So if the possession and manufacture of substances are so strictly controlled and punished, how are Chinese companies managing to produce enough precursor chemicals to devastate so many towns and cities in the US? This is where the issue gets a little thorny, to say the least. The drug laws in China and the US are very different and quite complex, to be honest. While the US can effectively put a blanket ban on any and all drugs containing a certain ingredient, China's legislative powers are much more cumbersome and unwieldy. Lawmakers can only ban individual drugs as they are developed or come onto the market one at a time. For that reason, laboratories in China can simply rebrand the same drug and freely distribute it both domestically and internationally. Put simply, if X drug is banned, the manufacturers can simply call it Y and carry on selling it. Naturally, this renders the drug laws, no matter how tough and uncompromising they look on paper, effectively useless. Bryce Pardo, a drugs policy expert at the Rand Corporation, paints a vivid picture of the country's limited regulatory capacity. Gaps in regulatory design, the division of responsibility between provincial and central governments, and lack of oversight and government and corporate accountability increase opportunities for corruption. And it's this corruption and these precursor chemicals that are being processed by the Mexican drug cartels and smuggled into the mainland United States. It's a situation that's fueling what many are calling a devastating form of asymmetrical warfare on the United States, and what's been costing so many lives over the last quarter of a century or more. Now, terms like asymmetrical warfare and precursor chemicals may sound like very modern concepts in a very modern, sophisticated, and stealthy type of 21st century attack. Think election interference and corporate cyber attacks. But in reality, the current opioid epidemic has a solid and identifiable precedent in history, to the extent that many commentators feel that China's actions may well be an act of revenge rather than a new tactic or the ever more complicated and ever-shifting geopolitical battleground. To explain, we need to travel back to the 19th century and what Western scholars call the Opium Wars and the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. Around 170 years ago, the British attempted to flood China with opium. To cut a long convoluted story short, the British had taken a particular liking to the tea, porcelain, and silks available on the Orient, only they didn't have the financial resources, literally enough silver, to procure these goods in the numbers they wanted. This led to a huge trade deficit and an inevitable conflict. Remarkably, this huge demand for tea in England triggered what, in today's parlance, could easily be classified as a drug war. British merchants began to export opium and, to a lesser extent, cotton from India, one of its most prized colonies back then, to China. At the time, opium was illegal in England but was used in traditional Chinese medicines. Note that the recreational use in China was also illegal and not widespread at this point in history. The British started shipping tons of the drug, using a combination of commercial loopholes and outright smuggling to get around any bans or legal impediments. In a relatively short period, great swathes of the Chinese population became addicted to opium, and demand for imports of the drug exploded. Ultimately, this led to an unfavorable trade balance paid for by a steady loss of China's silver reserves. The figures tell us just how devastating this story was for Chinese society. 13.5 million addicts, with around 25% of the male population hooked on the drug. Opium dens flourished across the length and breadth of the vast nation. Whole communities were destroyed, families torn apart, countless lives destroyed or ended prematurely. Sound familiar? Naturally, this almost decimated the Chinese economy, weakening the social and political structure of the country behind the simple fact that a huge chunk of the available workforce was unable to physically work. They had been chemically incapacitated by the huge amount of potent drugs the Brits had been shipping into their country, and all because of the UK's new obsession with a cup of tea. The Chinese response was brutal, but it wasn't really until Chairman Mao's reign and the Great Leap Forward that the country went to some lengths to get the opium epidemic under control. Mao forced some 10 million addicts into mandatory treatment programs, executed countless numbers of opium dealers, and destroyed and replanted the opium fields. This point is worth bearing in mind, as we'll take a deeper look at how the US should tackle the opioid crisis later in the video. For now, let's return to the Mexican drug cartels and exactly how fentanyl and the precursor drugs that go into making it are finding their way to the US via China and the cartels themselves. According to a report in the UK newspaper The Guardian from May 2023, the US Attorney General Merrick Garland called the Mexico-based Sinaloa cartel the largest, most violent, most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. But they are just one link in a chain connecting the cartels to Chinese companies and criminal organizations, relationships that are now drawing increasing attention from the US government. In response, Chinese officials deny any connection between Beijing and illicit fentanyl production and export, and their arguments have some foundation. The country's leadership was the first to schedule the opioid as a narcotic, in effect criminalizing it. Furthermore, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson claimed that Mexico had yet to notify China of the seizure of any illegal precursor shipments to the cartel's so-called superlabs, which turn those precursors into fentanyl. Yet the evidence of the relationship between the cartels and Chinese entities is nothing new. US law enforcement agencies have tracked the cartel's supply chains and money laundering networks ever since they expanded into China almost a decade ago. In fact, when fentanyl first started appearing in street drugs, most of it was found to be sourced from China. But the cartel's links to China don't end there. In a BBC report from October 2017, the US authorities issued the first ever indictments against 2 Chinese individuals for conspiracy to distribute large quantities of fentanyl as well as other opioids. Even more worryingly than the ease with which this drug can be produced is that it's being sold directly on the internet and sent by post, either directly to the US or to trafficking networks based, you guessed it, in Mexico. From the same BBC report, the European Drug Monitoring Agency made the following remark. It appears that most shipments of new fentanyl coming into Europe originate from companies based in China. So despite Beijing's firm rebuttals, there is increasing evidence that China is indeed leading the source of the problem. Worse still, there is now a deepening rift between Washington and Beijing, driven by accusations of intellectual property theft and spying, as well as geopolitical strains from issues such as Taiwan and the war in Ukraine. All crucial aspects in an increasingly high-stakes political chess match which is threatening to engulf a world already teetering on the brink of disaster and, potentially, a nuclear conflict. And what about the Mexican drug cartels? What part are they playing in the plot to destroy the US with drugs? These organizations now control vast areas of the country and are responsible for political corruption, assassinations, kidnappings, international money laundering, and of course, drug dealing activities. There are four main players on the scene: the Sinaloa, Jalisco, Gulf, and Los Zetas cartels, mostly based in the northwest, northeast, and west of Mexico. Over the years, the cartels have constructed a vast network of drug-making and distribution facilities in the towns and cities. Despite the devastation they wreak, not just abroad but domestically as well, they are often championed by their own people for standing up to their evil imperial overlord, the very same United States of America. Now that we've highlighted the problem in detail, it's time to look at the solutions available to the US. For many, there are only two viable strategies. Firstly, a legalistic approach, and the good news is that steps have already been taken to reclassify opioids into Schedule I substances. Back in May 2023, a bill was approved to do just that, make fentanyl a Schedule I substance, the most dangerous classification of drugs. According to a CBS report, this will allow for tougher penalties and prompt further research into a drug that has claimed thousands of American lives. Note that in the broader legal definition, Schedule I drugs don't have any medical use and are highly lethal. US Republican Bob Latter from Ohio has campaigned tirelessly for these new laws to be enacted. For too long, our nation has battled an opioid epidemic fueled in recent years by illicit fentanyl and its analogs, which claimed the lives of more than 5,000 Ohioans and 70,000 Americans in 2021. Our constituents need the solution. Lives are on the line if we do not act. This is a hugely positive step in the right direction, no doubt, but how effective the new legislation will prove to be is up for debate. Remember, America has been conducting, and to more cynical observers losing, a war on drugs long before President Nixon made it part of his administration's policy back in 1971, stating that the drugs were public enemy number one. The Smoking Opium Exclusion Act of 1909 banned the possession, importation, and use of opium for smoking. The Prohibition laws, a spectacular failure, came along around 10 years later. There was the Marijuana Tax Law of 1937, a Controlled Substances Act (CSA) in 1970, Nancy Reagan's famous Just Say No campaign, and the subsequent Anti-Drug Abuse Act of the 1980s. And perhaps most tellingly, the more recent legalization of marijuana in several states and the District of Columbia may herald new, more liberal and effective policies. The point being, just because legislation is introduced doesn't mean the problem is going to magically disappear. That's where option number 2 comes into play. The declaration of an all-out war on the Mexican drug cartels responsible for refining these drugs and smuggling them into the US. And by all-out war, we mean sending troops into the country and literally destroying the cartels at the source and putting them out of commission on a permanent basis. But how likely is such a radical and blitzkrieg approach? Ultimately, an all-out assault on Mexican drug cartels would be a tricky proposition to sell to both Congress and the American people. The economic ramifications alone could spell disaster for many industries. But why? There are many legal issues tied up with launching any such attack. Principally, the US government would have to redefine the status of the drug cartels through the US courts as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. Then President Joe Biden would be legally entitled to deploy military force to overcome the drug problems posed by Mexico. If the drug cartels were designated as FTOs, however, it would have the aforementioned crippling economic effects on Mexico. Some experts estimate that it could hit the tourist sector particularly hard, and when we say hard, we're talking to the tune of $20 billion or 8.5% of its GDP. Naturally, people would be scared of traveling to a country riddled with terroristic elements. Other economic arguments are just as compelling. Trade between the US and Mexico alone is worth $72.1 billion. huge figures that can't be discounted. But it isn't something that hasn't been discussed between the two governments. Since 2006, when Mexican leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador declared his own war on drugs and the cartels that control them, 360,000 citizens have been victims of drug-related homicide. Despite partnering closely with the US, receiving billions of dollars to modernize its security forces, reform its judicial system, and fund development projects to curb migration, no real or lasting progress has been made. With all these provisions in place, Washington had hoped to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the country by bolstering security and monitoring operations along the border, but to no avail. Furthermore, there are serious logistical obstacles that may be almost impossible to overcome. The cartels are far from stupid and far from easy targets. The drug-producing facilities are invariably located in the hearts of towns and cities, in built-up, highly populated areas. If, for instance, the US were to launch a drone strike against the cartels, there would be a considerable risk of massive civilian casualties, something no US president wants to face. Worse still, the cartels routinely recruit impoverished child soldiers to both deal the drugs and patrol the streets on their behalf. Again, the last thing the US government wants is the image of dead children being transmitted across the world. For all of the above reasons, military action is as unlikely as it is unworkable. But perhaps that will all change come November. It's no secret that the US presidential election takes place later in the year. At the time of scripting this video, it looks increasingly likely that current incumbent Joe Biden will face off against former President Donald Trump again. Any short to medium-term strategy to foil China's sinister plan to destroy the US with drugs lies very much with whoever will be in the White House come next year. So what are Biden and Trump's views on drugs? Historically, throughout his political career, Biden has earned a reputation for being tough on crime, for some, too tough. To illustrate this point, back in 1989, at the height of punitive anti-drug and mass incarceration politics, Biden, a senator then, went on national television to criticize a plan from President George H.W. Bush to escalate the war on drugs. Quite frankly, the president's plan is not tough enough, bold enough, or imaginative enough to meet the crisis at hand. He backed this stance through the late 1980s and early 90s by writing many of the laws that helped build a punitive criminal justice system that enacted more incarceration, more prisons, and tougher prison sentences for drug offenses, particularly crack cocaine, which had reached epidemic proportions at the time. And while his stance may have softened somewhat during his election campaign and subsequent victory, Biden introduced the National Drug Control Strategy in April 2022 to combat the very overdose epidemic we've put under the spotlight in this video. Similarly, Trump has also adopted a hard line on crime, both in and out of office. According to a CNN report from 2020, the federal government under Trump attempted to combat addiction and overdose deaths from opioids, setting restrictions on opioid prescriptions, calling for a public health emergency, and launching ad campaigns aimed at young people who might abuse the drugs. Furthermore, Trump's administration expanded access to the opioid overdose antidote known as naloxone and made concerted, if not hugely successful, efforts to convince China to cease illicit fentanyl production and exporting, among other efforts. A bitter trade war ensued. Tellingly, both men have been touched by drug-related tragedies in their families' lives. Trump's brother's death due to complications from alcoholism was the reason why he's been a teetotaler throughout his adult life. Meanwhile, Biden's son's struggles with substance abuse have been well documented, not always compassionately, in the media ever since his election. All of which suggests that the opioid crisis would be high on both men's agendas should they be re-elected. Whatever the solution, one thing is clear: America has to act quickly and decisively before millions more lives are destroyed by fentanyl. However, the real and abiding worry for US citizens, those being impacted by fentanyl on a daily basis, is the current international situation. And perhaps it's this which brings us full circle. If China really is trying to erode US social structure by flooding the country with a highly addictive drug, such global instability is playing right into Beijing's hands. At present, the world's eyes are glued to the war in Ukraine, Israel's increasingly brutal incursions into Gaza, Iran's recent drone attacks over Jerusalem, and the very real and worrying possibility of a nuclear conflict. For that reason, even the biggest and most powerful nations on the planet have domestic blind spots. And while the figures flagged up at the top of the video are staggering, such an oversight on the US's behalf could have truly significant ramifications later down the line. By the time the global situation has calmed down, it may already be too late. Conspiracy theories aside, it's hugely unlikely that the Chinese government has been directly involved in the manufacture and global distribution of illegal drugs into the US. But that's not to say they aren't fully aware of the situation, and it's perhaps their unwillingness to both act and cooperate with their American counterparts that tells the true story. For the time being, we can only watch this space and hope for a positive outcome. Now we're coming to the end of the video. It's time to ask you what you think about the current crisis that's ravaging American society. How do you think the US should tackle the opioid situation? Will new legislation be enough to solve the problem? Alternatively, would targeting the Mexican drug cartels responsible for shipping opioids into the country with military action be the best tactic? Or would the US be better off confronting the source of the problem, China? If so, how would Biden or Trump go about it? Diplomacy, economic sanctions, proxy wars? Let us know in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out The Hack That Made China a Military Superpower, or click this other video instead.